I'm Marci Baker of Alicia's Attic, here to share with you the clear view of quilting. Today we're going to work on half square triangles like the blocks on the wall behind me. And I'm going to have you start with 2 squares that are put right sides together. And then we're going to sew a 1/4 inch on either side of the diagonal line. Cut it in half, and then we're going to press them open and we'll get 2 blocks like what you see on the wall. We're going to be doing this without marking the line on our squares. I'm going to be using Q-Tool sewing edge on the bed of the machine. Let me show you how easy it is. When we're working with half square triangles like this sawtooth unit that I show here, you need to know what is the finished size of your square. This one's 1.5 inches. You're going to add 7/8 inch to your finished size in order to figure out what size square to cut. So these are 2 3/8 inch cut, and then we sew on either side of the diagonal, and that gives me 2 squares that will end up finishing out to 1.5. Some instructions will have you add 1 inch, but know that you'll have to trim those later. With 7/8 you won't necessarily have to trim. And you will get 2 squares that look like this and then finish out to 1.5. Let me show you how I easily cut these squares. Here I have my 2 strips right sides together. That'll make the next step easier. And I'm going to use a product called Q-Tool's cutting edge on the underside of my ruler. Marking my 2 3/8, it sticks without adhesive so I can reposition it, use it over and over. And it's thick enough that it catches my fabric. You can see how that's pushing up against the fabric. And I can quickly rotary cut and align my ruler. Before I take my hand off of the ruler, I pull this fabric away, and then I move my ruler over and it catches again. I'm pushing a little bit harder so you can see how the cutting edge will stop at the edge of the fabric. Now that we have our squares cut, let's go on to the next step. Instead of marking my line with a pen or pencil, I'm going to crease it. I'm going to bring this top point down to the bottom point and align it up right on top of each other. Hold that point, and then I'm going to take my iron and just set it down on top of that fold. And now I have a fold that runs along my diagonal. I'm going to leave this folded and use it that way. However, you do need to be careful not to take your square and then not get those lined up, because you can see here that we've got problems with fabric sticking out and it's not diagonal to diagonal. So the point has to be right on top of the other point, and then we can put the crease in. And just hold it there for a little bit. Now there is an issue that may happen. Let me show you that. Here I have my square and I bring it down point to point, but things aren't looking diagonal to diagonal. The problem is this is not a square. I'm off by a little bit. So if you're having difficulty with that, you want to check and make sure you're working with squares. Let's go on to the next step. Okay, it's time to sew. And this is my favorite part. I really think this is cool. I have Q-Tool sewing edge on the bed of the machine, and it has a raised edge. It's marking a scant 1/4 from my needle, which happens to be right along the edge of the foot. And I'm going to take this crease that we just made in the square, and I'm going to run that up against the sewing edge. I'm also going to make sure that this point follows the edge of my foot, and then the other point follows along the sewing edge. And I sew to the end of it. Let's do another one. And I'm going to line up my crease with the sewing edge, and this point goes in at the right spot for this machine. The way I have it set up is right at the edge of the foot, and I watch this point and make sure it follows the sewing edge. One more just for extra practice. We're going to have this point following the sewing edge. That's where the crease is. It just kind of catches up against there. And then make sure that that point follows the edge of your foot or wherever you need it to go, and that this point follows the edge of the sewing edge. Now that I'm done there, I'm going to sew onto my stoppie. I just really like my starty stoppies. Save me a lot of thread and time. I have one side sewn. Now I need to sew the other. We're going to turn the work, and we're going to again put our fold up against our sewing edge and watch the points and make sure that they go in following the sewing edge all the way. And now we're going to sew onto our stoppie. Sew to the edge of it, clip off the work, and now we have our strips sewn. If you're working with larger squares, you won't be able to line up both points as easily as I showed on the other one. But what I do know is that this fold needs to stay along the crease. So I can bring this up a little bit and see where the fold is and make sure it's running along sewing edge. You can also feel it. But then as I get to where I can see the point, make sure it's running along that edge of the sewing edge. And with larger squares, I recommend just sewing one at a time. And watch that first point that it goes in at the right spot, and then you have your fold up against the sewing edge. Again, you can turn this up a little bit and see that you have the fold up against there. And watch that point. So that's how you work with larger pieces. Okay, here we have our blocks sewn, and they're stitched together still. I'm going to cut them in half along the diagonal. And as I place my ruler, I'm just lining up the first one down here in the lower right corner. I'm going to line up point to point along my ruler and cut that, just that first square. And I'm making sure that I don't cut off those little stitches that hold those pieces together. You'll see why in a second. And then I'm adjusting the ruler basically to cut each square on its own and cut on the diagonal. Now I have pieces that are still sewn together, and I'll be able to take those to the ironing board and we'll be ready to press. We're now at the pressing stage, and here is my ironing surface, which I like to have flannel, cotton flannel on my ironing surface because it allows these fabrics to stick, and you'll see in a minute how that's going to help. The other thing I watch for is on my iron, I want to have an iron that has a nice edge that is not too round and not too straight on this edge, because I'm going to use this edge to push against my fabric. Now I set my fabric, or set my seams, with whatever fabric I want to press towards on top. I want to press towards the red on this one, so I have red on top, and then I'm going to slightly lift that up, and I'm going to let the edge of my iron do the work for me. It's going to push against that seam, and it's going to catch it. Because I have an iron that has a nice, not straight edge, but kind of rounded, it's going to catch that fabric and just push it back for me. If it's too rounded, it'll run right over it, and if it's too sharp, it'll cut right into it. So you'll need to check your iron and see what works for you. But just lift this a little. Don't pull it back too far, because then my 1/4 inch flips the way I don't want it to go. I just lift this a little bit and then let the edge of the iron push up against there. And yes, I am moving my iron sideways, and yes, you do hear steam. I'm working with steam. I use it all the time. But I can use steam because I let the edge of the iron do the work. I'm not pulling and tugging on the fabric. To measure your square, align your ruler so that you have 2 inches running along one edge and 2 inches along the other edge. If you have a diagonal line, it's great to line it up along the diagonal seam. This looks great. I was quite impressed whenever I first came up with this technique as to how close it got my 2-inch squares. I really don't have to do any trimming, except I do cut off the corners. But every now and then I'll find a square that looks like the following. On this one, as I line up my ruler, and I have the diagonal line, and I have 2 inches running along the bottom here and 2 inches up there, I have too much fabric up here at the top and not enough fabric down here at the bottom. I could push this up into the corner slightly, but you can see that I'm starting to get things sticking out on these corners now. So what I want to do is look and see what's going on. This is a little further off than I would like to see, and I'm going to see if I can fix it by looking at the seam allowance. So I'm going to turn this over so you can see the seam better. And here I have a very narrow seam, and then it gets wider at the top. And so I think if I take this and start stitching here and stitch along this with a narrower seam and then rip out this extra wide one, that I'll get the square that I need. It may be a little bit large, but I can trim that off, but I'll have a nice diagonal that's square to my edges. So we can do that. Now, wasn't that a hot technique? You can use this on any size half square triangle or 1/4 square triangles. I hope you've found this information to be helpful. My goal is to make your sewing and quilting even easier and frustration-free. It's all a part of the clear view of quilting. Thanks for watching today. I'm Marci Baker of Alicia's Attic. Over the years, I've had people ask, who is Alicia? I named Alicia's Attic after my grandmother. Gram was definitely an inspiration to me in her love and her compassion, her patience and her strength. This is to say thank you, Gram, for everything.